everybody. Welcome to
You can eat on here.
our knowledge sharing event. I hope you can hear us okay. If you can hear us okay, could somebody just give us a thumbs up or write in the chat? Okay, great. That sounds good. All right, well, we're going to get started. Welcome for those of you who are joining us online. We're about to start our knowledge sharing event entitled Mental Wellness and Suicide Prevention Through Community, Culture, and Education. This is a knowledge sharing event with some guests of ours to Toronto, some dear friends, Luke and Waikaremoana, and their friends who are here to share some of their knowledge and perspectives and hot takes and opinions and research informed knowledges as well, related to the practice of mental health and suicide prevention, but from within a Māori context.
You guys want to introduce yourself? We'll go this way. I'll pass this around. You go further from the south.
Good everybody, my name is Regan Belzer. I'm from the Aotearoa tribe in Rotorua, in New Zealand, as well as in Tauranga, Ngāti Ranginui. Our tribe in Ngāti Ranginui, Tauranga Moana, we have a story about our mountain, and our mountain's called Mauau, which means to be captured by the sun.
What do you mean?
The story of our mountain is that the mountain was betrothed, was in love with another mountain, and
Yeah, we're rolling.
because he was a slave, he wasn't of the same rank, he couldn't be with her, and then he left in depression, and he asked the Patupaere to pull him out to the ocean in the darkness. And just as they pulled him out to the sea, just before he got to the sea, the sun came up and he was captured by the sun, and the fairy people ran away. So the analogy of that story is that when our people go through depression and darkness, if we can just capture them by the sun before they go right out to the ocean, then they can be saved. So yeah, I just bring that story here in relation to talking about suicide prevention, and that it's in our narrative stories, our wellness and our ways of healing and saving our people.
Which tuataia ke tikana me mihi ki a koe Elder Clay, nā mi tuku tātou karakia te ata nei te ahia nei teira tēnā koe o tēnā tēnā tātou. Huri tēnei o Ngāti te whare toa, tōku ingoa ko Luke. My name is Luke. My tribal affiliations in Aotearoa, New Zealand are to the mountainous areas of the central North Island, known as Ngāti te Whare Toa, quite possibly the greatest people of all of the tribes in Aotearoa. And
Possibly.
I'm here alongside my colleagues here to whiri kōrero, which is to sort of share some of our thinking and our knowledge and where the commonalities are across our Indigenous practices are. Kia ora.
Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Waikaremoana Waitoki tōku ingoa. Kia ora, hello everybody, my name is Waikaremoana, and I am from the central North Island of New Zealand, Waikato University, and it's my privilege and pleasure to be here and holding this sacred feather, and I give thanks to the eagle that flew with this.
Hello, everybody. And hello, everybody online. Danse, Jeffrey and Ansloos, son of Czech Recipioche. My family comes from Fish River Cree Nation, and I work here at the University of Toronto in the Department of Applied Psychology and Human Development. And it's really wonderful to host you all with us this week and these varied events that we've been hosting, and really looking forward to a conversation today that really, allows us to learn and to hold the wisdom that you bring from your particular perspectives and experiences. So thank you for being here. I'll pass it now to.
Bonjour, my English name is Suzanne Stewart. My name in my language is Etsy Wedson. I'm from the Yellowknives Dene First Nation, Northwest Territories. I'm a psychologist and professor here at the Dalwhinnie School of Public Health at the University of Toronto, director of the Waikaremoana Institute for Indigenous Health Research. Welcome. It's a pleasure and honor to be here among my colleagues from another place, and I'm humbled by all of you, your energies. That's chill.
Tēnā tātou, ko rongo mai au te whaiti tōku ingoa. So my name is Rowe Te Whaiti, he uri ahau no Ngāti kaupapa ki Wairarapa, no Waitahu ki te Waipounamu. And I'm a visual artist, I'm a painter. Thank you for the very warm welcome this morning. I work at Massey University in Wellington. I'm in Aotearoa as the Kaihautu Toi Māori, the director of Māori art. That's me. Thank you.
Tēnā koe pe katoa e te whānau rungi te ipurangi o tira kia koe te kaumātua. Ko koe hei kawi atu nā karaki o tō tata nei hui. Greetings to all those here in this webinar. My name is Horo Mona Horo, and I come from a number of First Nation tribes in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and it's a pleasure to be here to continue to share the tears that fall from Sky Father to Earth Mother that speak of story, but also knowing as the tears drop onto the land, it creates nutrients and it shares the stories of the past to help us flourish into the future for those still yet to come. And so over the years, I've worked with youth in suicide, worked with youth with alcohol and drug issues, and continue to work with our people back home using our creative practices, our art forms, as well as our different stories of knowledge from our cultures to be able to uplift and bring back the healing for our people. Māori.
Oh, great, brother. Good. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let's jump right into it. A lot of people have joined this webinar today to really learn about and think through Māori approaches to mental wellness and suicide prevention. And I know you both personally, but for those folks who are just meeting you for the first time, I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about like who you are and what led you to the work that you do in Māori psychology, and your work within Māori and Pacifica and broader contexts. Just what led you to this path? So yeah, I'd be really curious.
Thank you. And I just wonder though, like, is this an opportunity to jump into the little bit of background of New Zealand? Or we had this conversation that we were coming over.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And maybe I'll try and weave in my story as well. So probably to start with my story, it probably goes back to when I was 10 years old, so only a couple of years ago. And at that time, I had a first cousin living with us, and I'm sure it's a similar experience here where you have intergenerational living arrangements and families. Except this first cousin was living with us. My father was a truck driver, 30 plus years, and he had an extraordinary brain and a real empathy for people. And this first cousin of ours had some behaviours that at the time hard to understand. Turns out later on, the diagnosis she was given was schizoaffective disorder. And if we're thinking about that sort of Western model, if you had to sort of choose one of those disorders, that's probably the last one on the list that you choose, because you get the double whammy of the mood and the psychotic sort of experiences. And so this cousin lived with us because my father understood his syndrome. So she became like an older sister to me. And when I was about 10, she barricaded me up against the corner of the house in the flight of what I've heard psychotic episodes, and said, look, you need to do something about the system. And I was 10. All I wanted to do was play sports and hang out with my mates. So this was a little bit of a, bit of a challenge, bit of a game changer for me, but something I never forgot. And I went about the rest of my life, went to college and came out the other end, still had this kind of idea. Didn't really matter and didn't care to me what vehicle I used, whether it's psychology, social work, nursing, whatever, but that I wanted to work in mental health. I wanted to do something for our people, with our people, and hopefully challenge the system a little bit. And so to bring it back to the sort of historical context, that was off the back of, at the time, a really big thing that happened in Aotearoa, New Zealand, which is called deinstitutionalisation. So a lot of big hospitals in Aotearoa back in the 1980s closed down with a number of the, what we refer to them as tangata whāora, people seeking wellness, transitioned from those big hospitals into communities. I mean, sometimes in their own homes, sometimes with family, sometimes in supported accommodation. So that sort of comes off the back of probably about 100 years prior to that of institutionalization, great big asylums. So, and probably at the same time of that 100 years, you had the different categorization systems. The one that we're familiar with at the time at least was the DSM system. The diagnostic statistical thing. 1 up to, I think it's probably to us 5 TR. And that went from something like, the DSM one was something like maybe 10 disorder categories at the time. So that's around about the 1930s, up into the DSM 5 TR, which is over 300 disorder categories. So if you didn't have a problem in the 1930s, you certainly did by that stage, as far as that categorization system. And then you can probably go back another 100 years prior to 1930, where we start to talk about our kind of pre and post-colonial experience. Now, there were a couple of big events that happened. First one is probably 1835. With what we refer to as our Declaration of Independence. And so for us in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the Declaration of Independence is our go-to document. It's our parent document that clearly establishes our rangatiratanga, our self-sovereignty. Really clear, can't be confused. And so 5 years later, because it was so clear and can't be confused, the British colony wanted to find a way to create confusion and noise by introducing the idea of what we know as today as the Treaty of Waitoki. So that was in 1840. I'm mindful too that as I'm talking about 200 years of history in about 10 minutes, and not to dismiss its importance or anything, but just perhaps to give a couple of headlines that might help to contextualize our talk and our story. So 1835, 1840. And then you've got a number of events, of course, that sort of happened. And probably what doesn't get mentioned actually is even back home in Aotearoa is what happens from 1840 to about 1860. And everyone during that time, for the most part at least, thrived. So post treaty signing, Māori, Pāgia, settlers, there was a number of communities in Aotearoa throughout the country who actually thrived. And a lot of that was off the back of Māori enterprise. So there was a lot of trading that was going on between the countries. Of course, the closest country to us is Australia. And so Māori are known to own their own boats, own their own infrastructure, the plough mills, water mills, thousands of cows, acres and acres, kilometres of orchards and the likes. And so they were servicing the bulk of the country and servicing the bulk of Australasia and travelling over to Sydney, to the great markets in Sydney. And of course, that freaked out a few people in the colonial space, particularly the British Constabulary. And then by about 1860, this is where colonial wars started. And then the effects of that, of course, we're all fairly familiar with in our different Indigenous stories. And I'll just touch on maybe one or two really key policies that have some relevance here. First one is from our educationalist sort of background, and that was the Native Education Act, roughly about 1860, 1867, something like that, which introduced this idea that Māori, very similar to other Indigenous populations, Māori were expected to learn the way of the white man at schools, and you weren't allowed to talk to their Māori, and so on and so forth. And on top of that, some of them were sent to be pulled out of their homes, their tribal environments, to live in boarding school environments and learn the way of the white man again, but just in a very confined and restricted space. So it was kind of like the double whammy of having to learn this stuff and also having to live it. And then probably the other one at the turn of the 19th century was the Tohunga Suppression Act, 1908, which really had an impact, particularly for our artists. And the impact was especially felt in what we refer to as our rongoa practitioners, or our sort of Indigenous tribal healing methods, which essentially suppressed some of those practices from being offered to the Māori communities. And if you can think about around about that time too, there were a couple of really big things that were happening globally. One was the Great Depression, and the other was the more so close to 1918, 1919, which was the great diseases of the time. And it ravaged a number of our communities in Aotearoa. So much so that I think it's something like for every white person that died as a result of the diseases, 8 Māori. So we've got stories in certain communities, particularly along the east coast, from, where they talk about up there in that forest, there is a great big mass grave of where they had to, and because it was also about having to seclude and isolate and separate out so that you would get affected. So those are some of the kind of key policies and events that perhaps helps us to contextualize our story here, and how that might help to kind of bring us to the here and now, because of course the journey might be different in terms of all of the Indigenous cultures around the world. Obviously the goal is often the same. And so for us, the journey has been very much about revitalizing, and we're probably in a space now of similar to the reclaiming of some of our stories and our names, and now probably reaffirming. Probably from about the 1970s onwards, the country went through what I would describe as a little bit of an identity crisis. For the most part, politically speaking, our leaders of the world at the time, leaders of the country rather at the time, were going around saying that New Zealand was this great place of harmonious race relations. And of course, if you were to talk to Māori, they'd say otherwise. And so they did. They did say otherwise, and they did it at probably the right time. Media was becoming a big thing, TV, those sorts of things. And then, of course, there were a couple of really big sporting events where we were able to kind of leverage some of the platforms and really push our message out there globally. And so we find ourselves probably on the cusp of something similar at the moment, because we've had a big government change, and with that, a number of significant policy changes, which I would sort of liken to what happened probably in the late 1800s, 1900s, where some of those policies are going to have a very negative impact on our people in a very catastrophic way.
I mean, some of the things you're saying are very resonant to what's happening in Canada. We similarly had the Indian residential school policies, which, I mean, their express purpose was to remove our language and culture and to like civilize and Christianize. And you know, the kinds of child welfare issues, the kinds of education systems issues, and certainly the healthcare systems have very similar impacts that we've seen over generations in Canada. What led you to this work, Mona?
You know, just in a nutshell, like, thank you, Lord, for how do you do that in a couple of minutes later? And I was just thinking of that question while Luke was talking, and you know, when you go into psychology, you go in, you know, just in my experience and people that I spoke to, you go in thinking that this is one of the disciplines that's going to help you to learn to work with your people. I was fortunate as well as that my dad studied psychology, so I saw these books, you know, growing up, and I eventually headed that way. I was sitting with my friend. She was a single parent, both of us were single parents, and we decided that's what we do, psychology. So something as simple as just talking to your friends. And so going through psychology and kind of coming out the other end, and then doing some PhD research, and in a phrase, it's this notion that Māori have a completely different way of viewing our health and well-being and what's going on for us. And so we talked about what his dad did, and I had talked to a really knowledgeable colleague who had worked with a Māori woman and who had cut herself. But she was so grieved, struggling with her grief, that she clawed at her face. Now, that within a Western system was pathologized, and they had viewed her in a particular way, but actually when my colleague spoke to an elder to help her understand like what's going on for this young woman, he said, our women cried tears of blood. That's how we healed. That's how we expressed our grief. And it's just that phrase, you know, crying tears of blood, because she had cut and clawed, and then her grief and her snot and her tears mingled. And it's that understanding of how do you understand, or how do you think about wellness from a Māori perspective, and how do you flip it away from a perspective that's going to institutionalize you and then push you through a system where you become more and more unwell at the end. And she did this, and not her, another one became quite unwell going through a similar process. So just like that. Oh, of course, crying tears of blood, where we would also like just cut our hair off and release pain, or cut to release pain. Of course, as we understand, that's viewed quite differently within a Western worldview, self-harm, and it's pathologized. So that's it for me. It was really to say we have a different way of doing this. That wasn't the catalyst. You know, we all grew up looking at racism and being viewed in a different way. So that was for me. The psychology that I learned harmed our people. It didn't help our people. It can help, and there's no doubt about that, but it needs to be on our terms. Yeah. Oh, sorry, but I have to talk for my mates who love psychology. As is completely.
What do you think?
Well, you know, I do hear a lot of similarities you know, in our colonial story, but of course the context is different.
Yeah.
Right, the themes are similar, but the context is different. But the experiences are very similar. And, you know, here in Canada, we're in the process, as you see in our very environment and how we're running this webinar is, you know, we're striving to center everything we do in ceremony, in traditional knowledges, and even in our language. And I think, you know, we would love to know how you integrate Indigenous knowledges, Maori knowledges, ceremony, spiritual, cultural practices, and language in your work in the application of psychology per se, as well as in specifically preventing suicide and self-harm, because you know that's something that we're all dealing with when we work with any young people. Self-harm it's something almost all young people that I've worked with self-harm in one way or another, overtly or covertly, they do it. And you know, working with that, we all want to know how we can use arts, cultural, and spiritual resources to address these things so that they are viewed in a healing way and not in a harmful way.
Not sure what kind of an audience we've got, so just to sort of caution people there, some of the conversations might be quite triggering, but you know, just in terms of the self-harm and suicide prevention work that we do. But Koromono was wearing a Māori All Blacks jersey the other night when we went to watch the Blue Jays play. It was our way of trying to be sporty, Koromono. The particular jersey he was wearing, though, it has three marks on each side, which represents a particular pūrākau or story that talks about Ripi Hai Hai, which is the cutting that occurs, especially in the context of grief. And the reason why I was on that jersey is because when we did some work with the Māori All Blacks rugby team, which is the first, the greatest rugby team in New Zealand, Aotearoa, it was about centering all of our knowledge on storytelling. And so, to come to your question, Suzanne, probably one of the foremost pieces of work that we do to try and gain that space in psychology is to center it on storytelling. We do that by way of what we refer to as pūrākau, which is our traditional storytelling. So we do that in a number of different ways, and perhaps the sort of preeminent practitioners in that space are Dr. Diana Kopua and Tohunga Kopua, who together have really helped us to not only understand at another deeper level around those stories, but how to practically apply them into clinical context, which has been a real gift, but also quite a challenge for a number of practitioners. And that started probably late 80s, early 90s, when, again, coming back to that deinstitutionalization period, one of the things that dropped out of that was the establishment of community mental health services. So everything used to be run out of hospitals. Then it moved into the community system. And then from the community mental health services, you had what we refer to as Māori mental health services, or specialist Kaupapa Māori mental health services. So those services had their own doctors, psychologists. And then from that, those Māori mental health services had tohunga, artists, kaumātua, elders that were specifically employed to work in that space and help guide and keep people safe in those spaces. And their role was to storytell. And our role as, I guess, clinicians, as practitioners, was to help translate that into clinical jargon. And we find a way to sort of make that work. Now, Lisa Cherrington is probably the other one that we would say is was one of the first in our country, at least, to sort of help us understand applicability of our storytelling into those sort of content. So yeah, centering it on storytelling.
That probably the closest way, well, a way of thinking about it is an entity team, a multidisciplinary team, where rather than there being OT, psychiatrists, nurses, the clinician is one of a team of artists, you have storytellers, you have tāmoko, so tattooists, and the clinician's role is to just watch that safety. Whereas the rest of the team, so everyone has a key role within. This is the group that, as Luke mentioned, Diana runs, and we're part of a bigger team. So embedding Indigenous practice means to take ownership of what that is, and I would say you have to lay the foundation for that to occur, and the clinician comes in, provides just one part of that service. It's not we're wrapped around the clinician or the clinical psychiatric services. We're just one part of it. But I just want to bring in Regan here, because Regan does work in the community and developing consensus. So I wonder, can I just invite you to say?
Yeah, I actually work in the Suicide of Māori, the Centre of Māori Suicide Prevention in New Zealand, and I work with two elders, a male and a female, and Ron Baker and Koromiko Richards. And Ron Baker's had over 40 years experience as a clinical psych nurse, so he used to work in those institutions, and was one of the first to establish Māori space for the people in there, and to provide a safe space for the workers as well, spiritually and culturally. But working with these two elders is so special in many ways, because they make me feel safe, but they have a depth of knowledge that is from another time and another space. And because they're male and female, they always come with something, a totally different view. So I've been on a very, very privileged journey with these two. But we do cultural training for people who work with, who have problems with suicidality or mental health. One of the key aspects of the trainings that we provide is the more we understand our cultural practices, and the more we understand our language and our connections to each other and to the environment, the more we can unpack and understand how we sit and what works for us as a people, what works for our people. And so I've been able to sit and really delve deep into, okay, we have these cultural practices that have come through for generations, such as our welcoming ceremonies. So one of my first tasks was to actually unpack the welcoming ceremony called a pōhiri and work out what actually does this mean for our people psychologically. If this comes from way back in time when it was just Māori here, then that's key for us in terms of how we view the world and existed and protected each other in those spaces and cared for each other. Because back in that time, the main thing was protection from the elements, from warring people, and protection of our babies, our families, so that we could exist and continue to exist. So those key aspects are crucial in understanding, okay, at that time, this is what happened. Why did those happen? And how did it happen? And actually, that's what was important for us. And I mean, that's a whole day training, but just one aspect of our welcoming ceremony, for example, is the whittle. And the whittle is when you have someone coming in, and then we will put out a challenger who will challenge the party coming in. And what they're actually doing is they're checking out to see if you are okay. If you are coming with good intentions, so this will be one of our strong warriors. If they find out that you're a warring tribe, or you have ill intentions, they won't let you in at all costs. But if you come in peace, then you can come and you can be safe with the tribe. So that's just one aspect. And then when we look at our people, and today you mentioned we have this kind of this mannerism can be challenging. Well, that's what our people do straight away. Is when you first meet us, we don't always accept you with open arms. First, there'll be a bit of a challenge, a bit of a who are you? Are you coming with good intentions? And are you safe to be in this space with my family and me? Or do I need to be careful of you? So just those sort of aspects. But I just want to mention one other aspect, which is key for us, because Waikaremoana and Luke mentioned tears and crying. And so our tangihana is what we call our funeral, right? And so for us, we'll have a 3-day funeral, sometimes more, sometimes less, where the tangi actually means to cry. So the purpose of that is people are to come and share emotions and to cry. And our elder Ron, he talks about a tear starting in your stomach. So we imagine it comes out of the eye and it starts somewhere, but he says it starts in our stomach. And if we think about our emotions, and when we suppress our emotions and we suppress our tears, we feel it in our gut, or we feel it in our throat, and it gets stuck there. So from Māori perspective, it's important to cry, to get those tears out of your stomach, to release that grief and that pain. And the more tears you can bring out, the more you can get rid of that. If you can't do it by crying, then there's other ways that you do it. One used to be through pain. The other way would be to yell, to karanga, to sing, to create, and all these aspects. And that's why the creativity is what gets that pain and that mamae and moves it and gets it up and out. Yeah, so, and a lot of our people hold that grief, and it sits in the tummy and it develops into sicknesses or whatever, and they don't know how to move it, because we've all been told, don't cry, just get on with it. But we actually need one way to move that.
I so appreciate hearing this piece, because so many people who are suicidal, navigating the desire to die, talk about a very difficult to describe kind of pain that sits in their bodies. And our spiritual practices give us ways of expressing that, like you've just spoken to. But the other thing you've said, all three of you said in different ways, is that it's something that elders often share when I talk about suicide, which is that it's a spiritual crisis. And that if you are going, and it's really shifted how I think about suicide too, because when I talk to young people who are talking about the desire to die, now I know, I'm like, oh, this is one of the most important moments of your life. You're on a spiritual journey, and if you navigate this journey, everything about your life could change. And it's interesting too, that's where we connect to those creation stories, and that's where we give those creation stories to young people. But to do that, you have to have that connection to language. You have to have connection to community and connection to culture. So I really appreciate your learning on that. We have about 15 minutes left of the webinar that we want to open up some time for questions. Before we do you have any other reflections you'd like to offer?
One of the often pushback for embedding Indigenous knowledge and content into practice is that it's not as understandable. And actually we've also internalized as Indigenous peoples, we've internalized this very Western view of understanding the world. And when it comes to working with our people who themselves have been colonized and have internalized a particular way of doing things, it is so very important to embed these ceremonies as, this is an entryway. And to take the time that it takes to navigate this new learning for them, which is like this Indigenous identity and who they are. And I'm a firm believer that you can do that gently, because if our family do push back and they actually don't want to engage in any Indigenous practice at all, that this is who they are. And there are multiple entry points into doing that. So it's not here you come into a service and you're going to be, forced to partake in Indigenous practices. And I've had a colleague talk to me about how one of her clients refused to come in and see her because she thought that the first thing that would happen is that she'd be drowned in culture, which is a very sad way of thinking about what someone is there to offer her. And when she did eventually come to see her, she, found it deeply moving. And you're skilled at what you're doing. You know that you have to take the time to introduce people. And sometimes it's actually just through food. It's a simple process of, we've had whānau, her family who will come into a service and they're court appointed actually at their 7th. You have to go, or else this time you're going to go to jail. And they've just gone because they've had to. So they go to the services for drug and alcohol treatment, and they have to. And then finally landed in a service where they're sitting there at the table and they're eating. So they're eating pork bones, which is a delicacy in New Zealand to eat a boil up. And they've come to see the service, which is a Māori service, and they're there only because it's going to keep them out of jail. And so they come in, and the service providers is there sitting at the table, like eating. So, come in, eating. And it was through that act of introducing them through the kitchen into the service. And that person has now gone on and is living a good life and is contributing back. So I think what we've each talked about is a way of being, and it's not isolated. It's not, make people cry when they come into the room, which is what psychology used to do, have you raging against a cushion. That it is really contextualized and embedded in so deep practices. No.
Do you want to offer any questions before we go to questions? Any further?
I have really so much to say. I don't think it is going to take up a moment. I think what I'm really intrigued by is how you offer this sort of holistic, for lack of a better term, approach. It's not just, you and the patient, client, community member alone in a room doing talk therapy. So for you, Indigenous approaches are about working from a cultural approach, which not only includes ceremony, but it also includes food, it includes art, it includes everything that is how you live traditionally in your culture prior to contact that you're still engaged with through the transmission of Indigenous knowledges through different means, such as art, for example. There's a big focus on that. And, I feel like we can learn so much from that. We do things like art therapy, but it's still very Western. And the type of psychology that I practice as a psychologist is very much more like what you do, but I'm very much in isolation in doing that. Like there's no evidence-based practices. If there's people like me, there's people like Jeffrey, there's a handful of psychologists across Canada who do things in a culturally based way with other practitioners, like with elders, taking clients out on the land to do ceremony. And that's just not something that's done here. And there's no system where you could go and get all that. And I guess I have sort of a question embedded in there. So this amazing way that you're talking about how you work with people, is that widely available in the common experience of all Maori who go to get help in mental health, or is it hard to access this type of thing?
It's hard to access.
Yeah.
It is hard to access. But then it actually isn't in a Kaupapa Māori, which is within a Māori run service. But sometimes even Māori run services have to meet Western standards, so you produce in a particular way. And so it's about being, I think, really creative in how you can offer these services, and it's negotiating and navigating. So you can be in a clinic, but but the space as soon as you walk into that room is, if you can get them in that room, so much more welcoming and different. It's not widespread. And what would you two say about the availability? I think it's not as available as we make it sound, but it's definitely available.
Well, I'm not a psychologist, but I have been around mental health most of my life. My family roots in it, but coming from a teaching background, healing doesn't always exist in hospitals and in places of, Western medicine. Often it happens with the community. Often it happens in their own self-learning. So I used to teach an art degree, and we had weaving students alongside us. And I watched these students from the beginning of the year just totally frazzled and disconnected and confused. And then I watched as they wove strand by strand and used our traditional flax, prepared it, and then learnt about it, and then started to weave these beautiful creations. And strand by strand, it was like they were putting their lives together. And they actually said that to me. That's what it felt like, is everything was out of their control and confusing, but as they wove, they were able to consider things and weave their communities and their lives together. And that's what happened by the end of the year. They were often confident individuals. So that's just in terms of an art practice and healing through that.
And I think that when we start to talk about empirically validated or scientifically informed, that's where we can jump into issues. And so the practices, and as we've said, and as our elder here said, is that these are established practices. Like, it's our grounded normativity. We know that it's worked for such a long time. It will continue to work. We just have to be, we have to be careful with it. But this story here, and I would much rather sit and talk story through weaving, not that I can weave, through a medium that allows people to talk, and cooking is one, gardening is one, walking is one, fishing, or any other way of getting someone to sit and listen and talk.
So, I totally agree. And also I always think when people say, like, what's the evidence base? I want to always ask the question, well, whose evidence? Which evidence? Because our communities, our cultures, our nations have generations of evidence. It's just what evidence you pay attention to. The evidence that you just shared in that story is evidence, different kind of evidence, but no less important. We have a couple questions from our participants. Thanks to all of you for sticking in this time with us. First question comes from Doris. Doris talking a little bit about just the impact of substance use in our communities, and especially the context of that in Canada. It's a leading cause of drug poisoning, and overdoses are a leading cause of death in First Nations among youth at the moment. But Doris asks, what options have been used to address that kind of repressed grief and hurt from particularly adverse childhood experiences? Are there any knowledges or practices that you bring from your kind of cultural practice that speak to that specifically? And then the other question is from Kristen Daigle, who's been reading a bit about weaving Indigenous knowledges and practices with clinical Western practices. I think you were talking a little bit about that before, Luke. Can you share your thoughts on this approach to clinical practice? Touched on it already, but how it shows up in one particular practice. So those are two questions. If you want to respond to one of them or both of them or whatever sort of touches your heart, feel free.
Oh, well, I'll answer Kristen's, because it's, yeah, something that I've already kind of touched on, and perhaps the way to talk to this is, again, using that sort of historical context. And for a long time, Māori practitioners, Māori psychologists especially, have been on this journey of moving from adaptation of Western models, where we take things like CBT and we've turned them into Brown language, or I don't know what the language is up here, if it's CBT or psychodynamic theories, whatever it is. And so in the 90s and even well into the 2000s, what we found ourselves doing, and I was guilty of this too, was doing exactly that, of sort of the weaving practice of taking your clinically trained models and adapting them to what you know. What we're doing now is reclaiming our traditional knowledge and that being our central sort of focus, and then
adding those strands in.
and people think that's innovative, like that's traditional. What we might be doing is contemporizing it and contextualizing it, but it's centered on what we refer to as Mātauranga Māori, which is our Māori knowledge base. So Regan was right when she said, you know, there are different ways and forms that we can seek health and well-being, even just in the word health. The translation to health in Māori is haura, except it's more than a translation, because it's its own knowledge base, it's its own paradigm, it's its own philosophy. Break the word haura down. Home means to breathe, water is to breathe life. And so that has its own kind of story. And I'm looking at a little bit because he knows this stuff better than I do. But when you then start to think about the differences between health and the differences between health and haura, you're going to get a much broader understanding of how we can sort of access that type of well-being and knowledge, as opposed to, if it's called a community mental health service, you're going to get a whole bunch of interventions, services that'll be premised on things to do with health, as opposed to
Where we start matters a great deal. Start with culture, start with language.
Yeah, and I think too that we do have our own evidence base, and we do have our own way of making sure we're not stuffing things up, making it up along the way without a frame. And so I think, you know, it's important to have a framework that you know will give you those supports and safety. So you consult with elders. It's something that you know exists in our knowledge systems. And I just want to make a plug here for Dr. Mark Bays, who has written a paper weaving sweetgrass. It's not the braiding sweetgrass, which is Robin's work, but Mark has written, and he's a clinical psychologist in Turtle Island, and he has written a paper that talks about a framework of how you know it's safe. And it is weaving sweetgrass, and those strands represent different ways of protection for your family and protection for yourself. I can have a plug at the first one if you like.
Yeah,
just
to speak to Doris's question, and then maybe we'll wrap up with one more question for that.
Yeah. That's such a good question, Doris. Thank you. And the work that and even through Te Raupara, actually, which is where Regan works, and Luke and I were involved in the inception of this particular program, which came about through conversations with community about how they were taught ways of being. And this particular young man talked about how his father had shown him how birds in that community, these are cormorants, how they protect their young and how they keep watch and where they grow and how they live. And so from this story, we developed a program to Pai Pai Tapiti. And it's a program for drug and alcohol and addictions and mental health. And it is really premised on this story, this origin story of how this bird protects its young. It does it purposefully, it does it selectively, it creates an environment for itself that ensures that it is not open to attack from predators. And so you take these values and you embed them into a teaching and a learning framework. And the work is online. The pai tata means that these are the things in front of you that you can work with now. These are the issues that are impacting on you, and they have this long-term under recognition of childhood adverse events. From an Indigenous perspective, when we look at what are childhood adverse events, we recognise the impact of systemic racism, we recognise colonisation, recognise the need to connect with culture. And then so we build that learning into it, and then the pai tapiti is the difference. So this is why have you chosen to do the certain things that you're doing? What's going to help you? What's going to support you? What are your goals and aspirations? And it's more than just saying, hey, look, these are the things in front of you that you can live for. Because, okay, cool, we all know these, yes, but actually the now is what are those things minute by minute, day by day, that's going to help you. It's a long program, but it is available online. I can send you the link.
Great, we'll share that with all the participants as well in the YouTube video that gets posted later.
Yeah.
I want to just say thank you for doing this with us. We've been really indebted in Turtle Island to the work of Linda Smith and Graham and other Māori dreamers and thinkers and knowledge holders. But I want to ask you a question inspired by decolonizing methodologies as like a parting thought. Maybe think of it as like one idea. If you had one beautiful, wild, wonderful dream for transforming mental wellness and health in Aotearoa in your lifetime, what would it be? And yeah.
Mine would be land, culture, language bank. Because from there, we would have the resources to create whatever our vision needs to be. In a nutshell.
That too, but and also I feel like we're on the path to living some of those dreams at the moment in Aotearoa. We have an approach and a system, a philosophy called whānau ora. Whānau being family, ora being health and well-being, but in a broader sense, it's a philosophy. It's a systemic approach to addressing some of the issues that as Indigenous people we all share. And there's like 6 or 7 outcomes, and those outcomes are actually born out of the Otago Charter, with the addition of a couple of extra what we think are more relevant to our context. And so those then become our kind of like our destination in terms of those 6 or 7 outcome areas, you know, things like participate in society, wealth creation, those sorts of things. But what's big for us, as it is for all Indigenous people, is being good stewards of the environment. So you know, talk about land bank. It's about also how do we look after Earth Mother? How do we look after our land? How do we be good kaitiaki, good stewards of that environment? Because that's going to be our greatest challenge moving into the next couple of decades.
Do you want to offer anything? Do you have a grand vision?
Well, I agree with everything that was said here. But just one line jumps into my head that my mum, who's fought for our people all her life, strongly reaffirms. There's also a line from Uncle Bob Marley, as biggest dream is to equip our people with knowledge to emancipate themselves from mental slavery, because we can have all the resources at our fingertips, but if we don't understand or know how to bring ourselves out of the dark and into the light, then we potentially can keep ourselves there. So
So we're running out of time. I would love to continue the conversation and, we will post this online on our YouTube channel, the Waikato YouTube channel. So please feel free to share it ongoing. And, in closing, I would just like to say thank you so much. I would like to turn to our knowledge keeper for some closing remarks on of anything that was said that stood out to you that are important to share before we do the spiritual closing.
No, it was great listening. Just a reflection, and made me start thinking about in the last few years due to this place. I've traveled the world. I've been to Brazil, I've been to Australia, I've been to all these and talked with all the indigenous people, right? And ceremony. And the same thing, the conversation, it's the same thing. It's the same colonialism, colonization, all of it, the doctrine of discovery, all of that, right? We've all gone through that together. We're all suffering from that. And it's just, and I hear them always talking about what you were just talking about. And that was just beautiful to hear what you're all talking about, all of this. And I think it's so important because when you think about it, the tribes of Europe are gone, right? We're the last of the tribes, right? There's some tribes in Asia, a little bit, Africa, a little bit, but more or less, we're the last of the tribes. And we still have that end. We still can follow our original instructions from creation. Call it what you want, right? We still follow that, and it's there. So we can, that's what I'm hearing. You're digging it up, right? I saw on the Amazon, they're digging it up. They're the tribes, certain tribes are so strong, certain, some are not. I went to Australia, same scenario, right? Everyone's digging it up because we are the children of the earth, right? And the children of the earth meant the children of God, right? And that's the reality. So now we're dealing with that and we're remembering that again. We're thinking about it, right? What I'm saying is we're remembering the gift, right? The creation has given us, our intelligence, right? I know nothing of your ways, and I really don't want to know, right? But I will support you. I will encourage you. I will pray for you that you will all get, and in return, I ask the same for us, right? And this will unite us as people, right? And we'll pray for each other. All of this, so we come back to the earth. We take care of her, the earth. That's what I heard here. So thank you for sharing that. Reconfirming all of that, what else I've heard from all of around the world. So we wish to you for that.
Thank you, everybody, for being with us today, and wish you a wonderful afternoon. Bye.